My daughter-in-law walked into my $12 million home with a notary and calmly told me the house now belonged to her and my son. I smiled and said nothing, because they had no idea I'd already uncovered the truth that would destroy their entire plan. The morning my daughter-in-law tried to take my house began in the most ordinary way imaginable. Sunlight was falling across my kitchen table, the same table where my husband and I had eaten breakfast together for nearly 40 years. The kettle was warming on the stove, humming softly, and the clock on the wall ticked with the steady patience of something that had watched an entire life unfold inside those walls. Nothing about that morning suggested that my family was about to try to erase me from my own home. Then the front door opened. Nonak. No hesitación. Just the sound of heels striking the tile as my daughter-in-law, Kendra, walked straight into the kitchen like she already owned the place. Behind her came a man carrying a small leather briefcase. And behind him my son Andrew. Andrew didn't look at me. If you're a parent, you probably understand why that detail mattered. There are certain things children do when they know they are crossing a line. They may not speak about it, but their eyes give them away. They suddenly find something else to look at. The floor. The wall. Anything except the person who raised them. Kendra didn't have that problem. She stood tall at the head of the table, perfectly composed, lipstick flawless, a folder tucked neatly under her arm. She looked the way people look when they are certain the room belongs to them. She placed the folder down in front of me. Slowly, almost ceremoniously. Then she smiled. "It's over, Mom," she said. Her voice was calm, polite, the kind of tone someone uses when they believe they're delivering news that can't be challenged. "This house belongs to us now." The man beside her sat down and opened his briefcase like he had done this 100 times before. Inside were papers, a pen, and a small stamp that he placed carefully on the table. A notary. At least that's what he wanted us to believe. The strange thing about moments like that is how quiet everything becomes. You might imagine shouting, arguments, maybe tears. But betrayal doesn't always arrive with noise. Sometimes it arrives with paperwork. Kendra slid the top document across the table toward me. "This is just a quick claim transfer," she explained lightly, like she was describing something simple and reasonable. "Once you sign, everything will be finalized. No more stress for you. No more property taxes. Andrew and I will take care of the house from now on." Take care of the house. The words sounded generous, but the meaning behind them was something very different. Stay, she had told me earlier that week. You can stay here, as long as you're cooperative. Stay. Not live. Not own. Stay. Like a guest. Like someone whose life inside these walls was suddenly temporary. I looked down at the paper. Then I looked up at my son. Andrew's arms were folded across his chest, his eyes fixed on the counter behind Kendra. He still hadn't looked at me. That was when I understood something important. They thought I was going to panic. They thought I would cry or argue or beg them to reconsider. They believed this moment would break me. And if you've ever been underestimated, you already know what a powerful advantage that can be. Because when people believe you are powerless, they stop being careful. They stop noticing what you notice. They stop realizing how much you already know. Before I continue this story, I want to say hello to those of you listening today. Welcome to Empathetic Story, a place where we explore the complicated, often painful truths that exist inside families. If stories like this matter to you, stories about trust, betrayal, and the difficult lessons that come with both, consider subscribing to the channel. Your support helps keep these conversations going and allows us to keep sharing stories that make people think. Now let me tell you what Kendra and Andrew didn't understand that morning. They believed they had walked into my kitchen holding power. They believed those papers on the table had already rewritten the ending of my life. What they didn't know was that I had been preparing for this moment for 2 years. 2 years of watching. 2 years of documenting. 2 years of slowly realizing that the people I loved most were quietly taking more from me than I ever imagined. And while they were walking into my home carrying a forged deed and a fake notary, I was already holding something far more dangerous. The truth. But to understand how that morning really unfolded, you have to go back with me. Back to the moment when I first started giving them money. Because that's where this story truly begins. And if you stay with me long enough, you'll see how a quiet mother sitting at her kitchen table ended up turning the entire story upside down. To understand why I didn't panic that morning in my kitchen, you have to understand the 2 quiet years that came before it. 2 years earlier, Andrew came to visit me on a Saturday afternoon. I remember the day clearly because the house still felt unbearably quiet back then. My husband Richard had passed away the previous winter, and I was still learning what it meant to live alone after decades of sharing every ordinary moment with someone. When Andrew knocked on the door that afternoon, I felt something I hadn't felt in months. Needed. He walked into the kitchen holding his phone, his face flushed with excitement the way it used to look when he was younger and proud of something he'd accomplished. "Mom, you have to see this," he said, sliding into the chair across from me. Kendra followed behind him, smiling politely, the way people smile when they already know what the conversation is about to become. Andrew began swiping through pictures of houses on his phone. Little front yards, bright kitchens, fresh paint, the kind of homes young couples imagine building their future in. "We finally found one we love," he said. I remember the hope in his voice. Not desperation, not pressure, just hope. Then he cleared his throat. "We just need a little help with the down payment." The number he mentioned was $37,500. He said it carefully, like someone asking for a favor but trying to make it sound reasonable. "It's not a handout," he added quickly. "It's just a step forward. Once we're settled, everything will be easier." Kendra nodded beside him. "It's really about building something for the future," she said gently. Now when you listen to a story like this, it's easy to imagine that the warning signs should have been obvious. But real life doesn't present itself that way. When your child sits across from you asking for help, your mind doesn't jump to betrayal. Your mind jumps to family. I wired the money the next morning. At the time I told myself it was a gift, a way to help them start their life together. But if I'm honest with you, and I want to be honest here, I think the decision came from somewhere deeper. Loneliness has a way of influencing the choices we make. When you lose a spouse after decades together, the silence that follows can feel almost physical. The house doesn't just become quiet. It becomes empty in a way that reminds you, constantly, that the life you built has changed. Helping Andrew made me feel connected to something again. I imagined Sunday dinners, future grandchildren, holidays where the house would be full again. That's the version of the story I believed in. What I didn't see at the time was the pattern quietly forming beneath it. At first the requests were small. A roof repair that insurance didn't fully cover. Groceries during a slow month at Andrew's job. A school program they wanted to enroll their daughter in. Every request came wrapped in gratitude. Every text message ended with "thank you" or a small heart emoji. I responded the way most mothers do. Of course. Anything for you. Take care of the kids. But over time something changed. The tone shifted. The requests stopped sounding like questions. They started sounding like expectations. "Things are tight this month. Can you cover this until we get back on track?" Just this once. Each time it felt temporary. Each time it felt like helping family. Months passed. Then more months. The numbers grew quietly. $1,000 here. $2,000 there. A medical expense. Car repairs. Kendra even mentioned starting a small online business and needing some early support. I helped. Because that's what parents do. We tell ourselves we're investing in the people we love. But here's something I've had a lot of time to think about since then. Sometimes what parents call love becomes access in the wrong hands. One evening, nearly 2 years after that first transfer, I sat down at this same kitchen table with a calculator. Not because I suspected anything terrible, just because I wanted to understand where my savings had been going. When I finished adding the numbers together, the total surprised me. $62,400. I remember staring at that number for a long time. Not angry, just thoughtful. Because numbers have a way of revealing patterns that emotions try to hide. And when I looked back at those 2 years of transactions, something inside me began to shift. Not yet suspicion, but awareness. The kind of quiet awareness that makes you start paying closer attention to things you once overlooked. That was the moment I began saving every receipt, every message, every explanation. At the time I told myself it was simply good record keeping. Old habits from the years I spent working around legal documents. But deep down, another part of me had already begun asking a difficult question. What if helping them was no longer helping at all? And that question, small as it seemed in the beginning, was the first crack in the story I had been telling myself about my own family. That quiet awareness, the kind that begins with a simple question, forced me to look at my life more honestly than I had in years, and it also reminded me of something my own family seemed to have forgotten about me. For most of Andrew's life I was simply Mom, the woman who remembered birthdays, baked lemon bars for church gatherings, and kept the house running smoothly while everyone else moved through their busy lives. Over time, that role became the only version of me people seemed to see, and in some ways that was my own doing. When you raise children, you slowly move your own story into the background. Your career, your experiences, the things you once knew very well, they all become secondary to the life you're helping someone else build. But before I was just a quiet mother in a cardigan, I spent 30 years working in a field where small details mattered more than anything. I worked in real estate law, not as a receptionist or assistant, the way some people casually assumed when they heard I worked in a law office. My role was far more specific. I was a title researcher. Now that might not sound like a dramatic job, but if you've ever purchased property in the United States, someone like me was involved behind the scenes. Title researchers study the legal history of land. Every deed, every transfer, every lien, dispute, and signature connected to a property. Our responsibility was simple in theory but incredibly important in practice. Confirm that the person claiming ownership of a property actually had the legal right to claim it. And to do that job well, you have to develop a certain kind of attention. You learn how to read documents the way a mechanic listens to an engine. Most people see a piece of paper and assume it's legitimate because it looks official. But when you've spent decades examining those documents, you begin to see things others miss. The pressure marks in a signature, the rhythm of handwriting, the placement of a seal, the timing of filings in county records. Fraud leaves traces, even when someone tries very hard to hide them. Over 30 years I saw forged deeds, falsified transfers, and dishonest attempts to manipulate property ownership in ways that would surprise most people. Sometimes the fraud came from strangers. Sometimes it came from business partners. Occasionally, and this is the part people don't like to talk about, it came from family members. So when I began quietly organizing the financial records Andrew and Kendra had accumulated over 2 years, something else happened almost automatically. I began checking the county property database. Once a week, just out of habit. The website allowed anyone to search property records by owner name or parcel number. Normally there would be nothing unusual to see. My home had been in my name for decades, and the record rarely changed. But the habit of verification never really leaves someone who has spent most of her career studying legal documents. You start to look not because you expect trouble, but because you understand how easily trouble can appear. I didn't tell Andrew or Kendra about those searches. I didn't confront them. I simply kept observing. The more I reviewed my financial records, the more I began to notice patterns, not just in the money but in the way conversations happened. Certain requests arrived at predictable times. Certain explanations repeated themselves. And something about the rhythm of those conversations began to feel familiar to me. Not in a comfortable way. In the same way a document can feel slightly wrong in your hands before you've even identified the exact problem. That instinct, the quiet sense that something doesn't quite fit, was something my work had taught me to respect. You don't ignore that feeling. You follow it carefully until it either disappears or reveals the truth. So when Kendra walked into my kitchen that morning carrying a folder and announcing that the house now belonged to them, something very specific happened inside my mind. I didn't see a shocking surprise. I saw a document. And the moment I looked at that document, my professional instincts woke up in a way they hadn't in years. The formatting looked convincing at first glance. The county emblem was printed in the corner. There was a notary seal. And there, at the bottom of the page, was my signature. Or at least something that looked very much like it. But experience teaches you that appearances are often the easiest part of a forgery to construct. The real story lives in the details. And the details on that page told me something immediately. Something that changed the entire meaning of the moment. Because the signature on that document looked perfect. Too perfect. And anyone who has spent 30 years studying legal documents knows that perfection in handwriting is usually the first sign that something isn't real at all. And the moment I saw that perfect signature on the page, I understood something that the people standing in my kitchen did not. Perfection is rarely natural. Real signatures carry hesitation. A slight change in pressure where the pen presses harder. A pause between letters when a person thinks about what they are writing. Those tiny imperfections are the fingerprints of authenticity. What I saw on that document was smooth. Even. Too clean. It looked like my name. But it did not feel like something I had written. That realization didn't make me angry. It made me careful. You see, when someone spends decades working around legal documents, the worst mistake you can make is reacting too quickly. Fraud often collapses under its own weight if you simply allow it to continue long enough to expose itself. So instead of arguing, I listened. Kendra continued speaking with the confidence of someone who believed the outcome had already been decided. She talked about how difficult it had been managing the property, how Andrew and she would handle the taxes now, how this transfer would make everything easier for me. She even used the word relief. "You won't have to worry about anything anymore," she said with a reassuring smile. That sentence stayed with me, because what she meant by relief was control. Andrew still hadn't spoken. He stood near the counter with his arms folded, avoiding my eyes. Every once in a while, he glanced at the document, then back at the floor. The notary, the man with the leather briefcase, shifted in his chair and tapped his pen against the table lightly. "All we need now is your signature," he said. His voice was polite but impatient. I looked down at the document again. The formatting was correct. The language was standard. The seal appeared legitimate. But there was one thing missing that mattered more than anything else. Verification. A document like that doesn't become legally powerful simply because someone prints it and places a stamp on it. It becomes real only after it is recorded with the county clerk's office. And that was the moment I realized something important. If the transfer had truly been completed 2 weeks earlier, as Kendra claimed, the filing should already exist in the county records database. Which meant there was a very simple way to confirm the truth. I stood up slowly from the table. "I'm going to step outside for a moment," I said calmly. "The begonias need watering." Kendra looked slightly annoyed by the interruption, but she didn't stop me. In her mind, the difficult part of the conversation had already passed. I walked through the back door into the garden. The afternoon air was warm, and the scent of the hydrangeas Richard planted years ago filled the yard. For a moment I simply stood there, listening to the quiet. Then I took out my phone and called someone I trusted. Mara. We had worked together years ago when I was still involved in title research. She had eventually moved into the county clerk's office, where she managed records in the property division. If anyone could confirm whether a deed had actually been filed, it was her. She answered on the second ring. "Dorothy? It's been a while." "It has," I said. "I need you to check something for me." I explained briefly what was sitting on my kitchen table. A deed transferring my home, supposedly signed 2 weeks earlier. I could hear her typing as she searched the records. A few seconds passed. Then another few. When she spoke again, her tone had changed. "That filing isn't in the system," she said. I felt a slow exhale leave my chest. "Are you certain?" I asked. "I'm looking at the database right now," she replied. "No transfer under your parcel number." For a moment I closed my eyes. That alone would have been suspicious enough. But then Mara asked another question. "Who's the notary listed on the document?" I glanced down at the name printed beside the seal. Jeremy Calloway. There was a longer pause this time. Then Mara said something that turned suspicion into certainty. "That license was revoked last year." The garden suddenly felt very still. "Revoked?" I repeated. "Yes," she said quietly. "We've already flagged several questionable filings connected to that stamp." I sat down on the stone bench beside the hydrangeas. And in that moment the entire situation shifted in my mind. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't a poorly explained family agreement. This was an attempted property transfer using a forged signature and a revoked notary license. They hadn't simply asked for my house. They had tried to take it. "Mara," I said slowly, "I'm going to need a title freeze." She understood immediately. A title freeze locks the ownership record of a property so that no sale, refinance, or transfer can occur without direct authorization from the legal owner. It's one of the most powerful protections available in property law. "You want it frozen immediately?" she asked. Yes, I said. She didn't hesitate. I'll send you the form within 10 minutes. When the call ended, I remained sitting in the garden for another moment, looking at the house. Inside those walls, Kendra and Andrew were still waiting for my signature, still believing the outcome was inevitable. What they didn't know was that the moment I walked back through that door, the story had already changed. Because from that point forward I wasn't reacting to their plan anymore. I was preparing to expose it. And once I understood that what had been placed on my kitchen table was not just a misunderstanding but an attempted deception, I realized something else just as important. Truth means very little unless you can prove it. That evening, after the house grew quiet again, I sat down at the same kitchen table where the whole performance had begun earlier that day. The documents Kendra had brought were still lying where she left them, perfectly arranged, as if the story they told had already been accepted. But stories written on paper don't become real until someone examines them carefully. I opened my laptop. If I was going to protect myself, I couldn't rely on feelings or assumptions. I needed something stronger than that. I needed evidence. Over the years, I had learned that when fraud happens slowly, the proof usually exists in the details people assume no one is paying attention to. Small financial records, messages, timelines. Little things that feel harmless on their own but reveal a pattern when placed together. So I began with the bank statements. 2 years of them. Month after month, I downloaded each file and placed them into a single folder. 72 statements in total. I labeled the folder something neutral, something that would remind me to stay focused. Family audit. Then I began reading them line by line. Each transaction told a small part of a story I had once believed without question. Transfers labeled, help for the mortgage. Payments sent during months when Andrew said work had slowed down. A few unexpected charges where my debit card had been used after he told me he needed it, just in case. At first the numbers felt abstract. But the longer I looked, the more the pattern became clear. $1,000 here. $2,000 there. $3,000 during the month Kendra mentioned starting a small online business. Each one came with an explanation I had accepted at the time. Each one came with gratitude that felt sincere in the moment. I created a spreadsheet and began recording them carefully. Date, amount, what they told me the money was for, and what the timing of that payment actually revealed. As the rows filled the screen, something inside me shifted again. Not anger this time. Something closer to clarity. When I reached the final statement and added the numbers together, the total appeared at the bottom of the column. $62,400. I sat back in my chair and stared at that number for a long moment. Money is a strange thing. It carries more than value. It carries memory. Each of those transactions represented a conversation, a moment when Andrew or Kendra had asked for help and I had given it without hesitation. Because that's what parents do. We help. We support. We believe the people we love when they say they need us. But looking at those numbers all together forced me to acknowledge something difficult. This hadn't been occasional help. It had been a pattern. And patterns are exactly what investigators look for when they build a case. That thought didn't come from bitterness. It came from experience. When you spend years working around property disputes and financial deception, you learn that the most dangerous lies are rarely dramatic. They are gradual. They happen in small steps that feel reasonable until the final result becomes impossible to ignore. Once the financial timeline was complete, I began organizing the other pieces of information I had quietly collected over time. Screenshots from social media. Photos Kendra had posted during trips or nights out that seemed oddly timed compared to the emergency she had described when asking for money. A rooftop bar picture taken in Miami only days after she told me she needed help covering school expenses. Restaurant photos posted during weeks when Andrew said they were struggling to buy groceries. Individually, none of those images proved anything. But placed beside the bank records, they told a story that words alone never could. By midnight, my kitchen table looked less like a place where family dinners happened and more like a small investigation room. Statements printed and stacked. The spreadsheet neatly organized. Screenshots labeled with dates. Everything arranged so that anyone who looked at it could follow the timeline clearly. Not accusations. Just facts. I placed all of the documents into a black accordion folder and wrote a simple label across the tab. Pending civil claim. The words looked strange to me at first. No parent imagines they might one day need to prepare legal documentation involving their own child. But protecting yourself sometimes requires accepting truths that are uncomfortable. Around 3 in the morning, I stood up to stretch and walked down the hallway toward the kitchen for a glass of water. That's when I saw Andrew. He was sitting on the floor against the wall near the guest room, his head in his hands. The hallway light was dim, and for a moment he didn't notice me standing there. He looked smaller than I remembered. Not physically, emotionally. I leaned against the doorway. "Do you remember when you were 8 years old?" I asked quietly. "And you took $20 from my wallet?" He lifted his head slowly. "You made me go back to the gas station and apologize," he said. "No," I corrected him gently. "I made you imagine getting caught." He gave a tired laugh. "I told you I wanted to buy you flowers," he said. "And you bought a video game instead." The silence that followed felt heavy. Finally I asked the question that had been sitting in my chest for months. "What happened to you, Andrew?" He stared at the floor for a long time before answering. "I thought things would work out," he said quietly. "Kendra, she wants a certain life. I kept thinking if I just got us a little further ahead. And you thought I would carry the rest," I finished. He didn't argue. He didn't defend himself. And in that silence I realized something that hurt more than the money. Andrew hadn't created this plan, but he had allowed it. And sometimes allowing something wrong to happen is just as damaging as planning it. I walked back to the kitchen and looked at the folder waiting on the table. The evidence was complete. Now all that remained was deciding when the truth would finally be placed in front of everyone who needed to see it. And I already knew exactly how that moment was going to happen. And once the evidence was organized and the truth was clear in my own mind, the only question left was how that truth would be revealed. I could have confronted them privately. I could have called Andrew into the kitchen and placed the folder on the table, and forced him to look at everything I had gathered. That would have been the easier path. The quieter path. But over the years I had learned something about deception. People who build their plans on secrecy depend on the assumption that everything will remain hidden. They rely on the idea that whatever happens will stay inside the walls of a family conversation, where facts can be argued away and emotions can blur the truth. If I allowed this situation to stay private, the story would always remain negotiable. And the truth, when it's negotiable, often disappears. That's when I realized something about Kendra's suggestion from earlier that day. She had said we should finalize everything with witnesses. At the time, she meant it as a display of confidence, a way to make the transfer feel official and irreversible. But the moment she said those words, the idea changed meaning in my mind. Witnesses would make everything clear. Just not in the way she expected. The next afternoon she called again, her voice energetic and almost cheerful. "We should schedule the signing," she said. "It'll make everything cleaner if everyone understands what's happening." I told her I agreed. In fact, I told her it was a wonderful idea. If you had heard her reaction on the phone, you would have thought I had just confirmed the happiest news imaginable. She believed the hardest part was already behind her. To her, the house had already changed hands. The signing was just a formality. But while Kendra was planning her little celebration, I was making a few calls of my own. The first was to Mara. "I'm going to need a favor," I told her. She listened quietly while I explained what I intended to do. When I finished, she was silent for a moment. "You want witnesses," she said finally. "Yes," I replied. "2 clerks from the office," she suggested. "Plain clothes. Observers only." That would be perfect. Having someone from the county present wasn't about intimidation. It was about clarity. When documents are examined by people who understand how property law works, confusion disappears quickly. Next, I made a list of people to invite. Neighbors. A few friends from church. Andrew's old college friend who now worked at a local bank. Even the woman who cuts my hair. Some people might think inviting neighbors into a family dispute is cruel. But remember something important. Kendra had asked for witnesses. All I was doing was honoring her request. The community center down the street had a meeting room large enough for a gathering like this. It was the same room where local groups held town meetings and charity events. Neutral ground. Plenty of space. No one could accuse anyone else of controlling the environment. When I suggested the location, Kendra loved the idea. "That's perfect," she said. "It'll make everything feel official." I could hear the excitement in her voice. There is something fascinating about the moment when someone believes they've already won. Their confidence becomes almost theatrical. Every step feels like part of a celebration. In her mind, the meeting would mark the final moment when the house became hers. In mine, it would mark the moment the truth finally stepped into the open. Over the next 2 days I prepared quietly. The title freeze confirmation arrived from the county clerk's office and was placed carefully inside the black folder. Mara sent a report confirming that the notary seal used on the document belonged to a revoked license. That report went into the folder as well. The financial ledger I had built over 2 years sat neatly behind those pages, each transfer documented and dated. Piece by piece, the folder became something more than a collection of papers. It became a timeline, a story written not with accusations but with evidence. The night before the meeting, I stood in the living room for a long time looking around the house. This place had witnessed nearly every important moment of my adult life. Andrew's childhood birthdays, holiday dinners with Richard, quiet evenings when the world outside felt too loud and this home offered peace. I understood something very clearly in that moment. If I allowed deception to rewrite the ownership of this house, it wouldn't just be a financial loss. It would be the quiet rewriting of an entire life. The next evening I dressed simply. A soft blue sweater, iron slacks. Nothing dramatic. The kind of outfit people expect a grandmother to wear to a community gathering. Because that's how most people still saw me. A quiet older woman navigating a complicated family conversation. Not someone walking into that room with a carefully assembled case. I placed the black folder into my bag and locked the front door behind me. The sun was beginning to set as I drove toward the community center. Inside that meeting room, Kendra and Andrew would already be waiting. The fake notary would have his stamp ready. The witnesses would take their seats around the long table. Everyone would expect a simple signing. But what they were about to witness was something very different. Because when the truth finally arrived in that room, it wouldn't need to shout. It would simply be placed on the table. And when the papers settled on that table and the room fell into silence, I realized something that took me years to fully understand. Truth rarely explodes. It arrives quietly and then it stays. The meeting ended without shouting, without drama. Without the kind of confrontation people imagine when families break apart. Most of the neighbors left slowly, speaking in hushed voices as they walked out of the community center. No one looked at Kendra the way they had when they first arrived. And no one looked at Andrew quite the same way either. But the real consequences of that evening didn't happen in that room. They happened afterward. In the quiet spread of information that follows any moment, when people witness something unexpected. By the next morning, word had traveled through the neighborhood in the gentle but unstoppable way stories often do in small communities. No one exaggerated the story because they didn't need to. The facts themselves were enough. A forged property document. A notary with a revoked license. A son and daughter-in-law attempting to take ownership of a house that was never legally theirs. None of those things required dramatic retelling. They simply required acknowledgement. Kendra withdrew from the community almost immediately. The committee she had once volunteered for at the school quietly replaced her. Invitations stopped arriving. Conversations that once included her suddenly happened without her name being mentioned at all. It wasn't revenge. It was something quieter than that. It was the natural consequence of broken trust. Andrew handled things differently. For several days I didn't see him at all. Neighbors mentioned seeing him jogging early in the mornings through the park before sunrise, head down, moving quickly as if distance alone might put space between him and what had happened. But the most important developments weren't social. They were legal. Within a few days, the county clerk's office formally opened an investigation into the notary seal attached to the deed. Jeremy Calloway's name appeared in a regional fraud bulletin circulated to property offices across the county. Once that happened, his credibility disappeared overnight. Fraud investigations move slowly but steadily. Paper trails have a way of speaking once someone starts listening. My attorney focused on something else. The financial record. The folder I had built over 2 years became the center of a civil claim that was filed shortly afterward. Every transfer Andrew and Kendra had requested was documented clearly. every amount tied to the explanations they had given at the time. The total was simple and undeniable. $62,400. The claim didn't accuse them of cruelty. It didn't dramatize what had happened. It simply presented the facts and requested repayment under a structured agreement. The judge reviewing the initial filing approved a temporary order preventing any future changes to the property title while the case remained active. That meant the house could not be sold, refinanced, or transferred in any way. The home remained exactly where it had always been, in my name. About a week after the meeting, Andrew came to my house. He didn't knock right away. When I opened the door, he was standing on the porch holding a plain manila envelope, the kind people use when they have something serious to deliver, but don't quite know how to say it. He handed it to me without speaking. Inside was a signed repayment agreement. 5 years. Monthly payments. A formal acknowledgement of the debt. I read the first page slowly. When I looked up, Andrew was watching the floor again. "You didn't have to do this," he said quietly. His voice carried the same mixture of regret and confusion I had heard in him the night we spoke in the hallway. For a long moment I simply studied his face. The truth is that being right doesn't erase the sadness of a moment like that. Parents don't raise children expecting to one day stand across from them in a legal agreement. But protecting yourself sometimes requires accepting that love without boundaries becomes something dangerous. "Yes," I said finally. "I did." Andrew nodded slowly. There was no anger in his expression, only the kind of understanding that arrives when someone finally sees the consequences of their choices clearly. He turned and walked down the driveway without saying anything else. I stood there for a moment after he left, looking out at the street that had been part of my life for so many years. The house behind me hadn't changed. The walls were the same. The garden Richard planted still bloomed every spring. But something inside me had shifted in a way that would never return to what it once was. If there is one lesson I carry from everything that happened, it's this. Protecting yourself is not the same thing as destroying your family. Sometimes the real damage has already been done long before the truth is spoken. All you are doing in that moment is refusing to pretend it didn't happen. And sometimes refusing to disappear quietly is the most honest thing a person can do. When I look back on everything that happened, the house was never truly the center of the story. The house was only the stage where a much deeper lesson revealed itself. What this experience taught me is that trust, especially inside a family, is one of the most powerful and fragile things we possess. We give it freely to the people we love because that is how families are supposed to work. Parents support their children, children respect their parents, and everyone believes that the bond between them will always be stronger than any conflict. But life sometimes reminds us that love without boundaries can slowly turn into something unbalanced. When generosity is given without limits, it can be mistaken for obligation. When kindness is offered repeatedly without reflection, it can quietly invite entitlement. The painful truth I had to face was that protecting myself did not mean I stopped loving my son. It simply meant I refused to allow love to erase my dignity. And that is a difficult line many people struggle to draw. The deeper lesson here is not about winning a conflict or proving someone wrong. The real lesson is about clarity. It is about understanding that compassion and self-respect must exist together. In practical terms, that means documenting important decisions, communicating clearly about money, and setting boundaries early before misunderstandings grow into larger problems. Families thrive when trust and responsibility grow side by side. When one grows without the other, the relationship begins to weaken. If there is one way to apply this lesson to everyday life, it is to remember that helping others should never require you to disappear from your own story. You can be generous and still protect your future. You can love someone deeply and still insist on honesty. Now I'm curious about your perspective. If you were in a situation where a family member crossed an important boundary, would you confront it immediately? Or would you try to handle it quietly the way I did? Please share your thoughts in the comments so everyone watching can learn from different experiences. And if stories like this resonate with you, consider subscribing to the channel Empathetic Story. Your support helps keep these conversations going and gives us the motivation to continue sharing meaningful stories in future videos.